impossible condition the World Bank has imposed onto vulnerable countries was a death sentence that diverted resources from the ones who needed them the most. On opposition, aid is a political tool that global superpowers use to consolidate their hegemony we're so proud to propose. With that, 4 pieces I'll set up before 2 arguments in this speech. Firstly, we believe that the World Bank should adopt a one country, one vote system. All countries will receive a single vote of equal weightage in influencing the bank's policies, which include the selection of technocrats and the executive board tasked with allocating funding, dispute resolution, and policy implementation, as well as formulating and approving economic solutions for crisis-stricken countries. Secondly, member states will be required to provide minimum annual contributions proportional to the GDP of each country. Countries will still be allowed to exceed their minimum contributions, but this will not be rewarded with additional political power. Thirdly, this will mark a demarcation from the status quo, whereby countries are given more votes in exchange for greater funding. But we believe the new one country, one vote system will not harm the ability of the bank to adequately fund its projects for 3 reasons. A, as the largest global financial institution, even with minimal amount of contribution, the resource pool that we have is remarkably high, such as even 0.1% of the US GDP will still already add $23 billion to the World Bank's budget. B, the World Bank also receives funds from non-state actors as well as charitable organizations, such as the bank having a long-standing collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with $1 billion for sanitation projects. And C, a significant portion of the funds that the World Bank has right now are raised in the financial markets through investments, the sale of bonds, and the repayment of recipient nation loans. In conclusion, the bank is ready to transition away from a system of politicized funding. And lastly, on our burden, we will prove why a politically clean World Bank is the only pathway towards fulfilling its agenda of equitable global development, even if it comes at the expense of less funding. With that, 2 arguments in the speech. Firstly, the weighted voting system undermines efforts to achieve the World Bank's goal of global poverty reduction. 3 parts under this. Firstly, current voting systems force developing nations to develop in a way that entrenches global inequality. This system enables the wealthiest contributors to overrule the interests of developing states. Due to the massive contributions, wealthy nations have a chokehold over the bank. The US makes up 16.7% of total World Bank spending, which, put simply, if 40 developing states vote yes on a policy in their interest, the US is able to overturn it single-handedly. In effect, countries like the US hold veto power over the global development agenda, and they can wield this power to the detriment of others. When providing loans, developed nations always care more about economic markers like GDP growth, even when it shadows socio-economic inequality, and reducing debt and public spending, even when it's necessary to save lives, imposing them as conditions to loans for countries starved of aid. Struggling with adjustment, countries face worsening socio-economic inequality and a debt burden to the bank. Secondly, the forceful imposition of first world economics jeopardizes the goal of the bank to alleviate poverty. Developed countries have exploited the bank to push their economic agenda of free trade. Developing nations are forced to open their economies to foreign imports, destroying underprepared local industries. To illustrate, the World Bank's structural adjustment programs in Senegal retrenched a third of their workers in the 1980s, pushing millions into unemployment and poverty. Other instances included when developing nations voted to cut subsidies that are perceived to limit free trade in developing nations. In 2021, Zambia was forced to eliminate food and fuel subsidies to address its debt. However, these are the same subsidies that kept prices for essential goods low, and the removal caused prices to skyrocket and entrench people into absolute poverty. Comparatively, an equal voting system will encourage representative reforms within the bank. Though developing states hold little economic capital, they significantly outnumber the developed world. By voting in blocs such as ASEAN or Latin America, they can implement nuanced solutions using their unique expertise. For instance, microloans set up by the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh help millions of poor families via microcredit systems. Under opposition, microloans will never be considered by developed nations, as low-income borrowers are seen as high-risk investments and they are not creditworthy enough via traditional banking assessments. Lastly, underrepresented states are pushed into competing but worse-off global frameworks on the side of opposition. The World Bank's legitimacy as a global body is contingent upon its member states believing that their needs are accommodated. Enforcing destructive policies forces nations to pick between economic survival or receive money from the bank. Prioritizing survival, they pivot away from the bank and towards alternative bodies such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the AIIB led by China. However, such organizations are also traps for exploitation. This is true because China leverages on the poor credit scores of desperate nations who cannot gain development aid to have important infrastructure placed as collateral. When nations default, China seizes their property and uses them to profiteer, such as with the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka. This cripples their long-term economic prospects once China is able to hijack their economies and restructure them to exclusively benefit themselves. Before I move to the second argument, I take a point.
The conditionality that the World Bank proposes is things like transparency of funds. Why do you not support the United States enforcing this to countries?
So transparency as a basic moral minimum will still be safeguarded on both sides of the debate. On your side of the house, you impose free trade and liberal standards imposed by the developed world, where it cripples developing nations. You have to listen to the nuance of the first argument. Second argument then, a one country, one vote system ensures a more equitably enforced World Bank. Three parts on this as well. Firstly, the enforcement of the World Bank under the status quo is arbitrary and unfair. Given that resources are zero-sum, any foreign aid can only be justified through the lens of accruing additional political gain, and thus there is an existent incentive to politicize funding within the World Bank. To illustrate, the US's yearly injection of $48 billion grants them unparalleled authority to determine the availability and beneficiary of their loans while being able to favor their allies. To protect domestic industries, the US has consistently pushed the World Bank to reject loans and support rival American goods. Within the steel industry, the US persuaded the bank to curtail loans to India and Pakistan's steel sectors during the 1970s. But in addition, the US's influence also inhibits countries from accessing resources. For example, $2 billion of aid was offered from the wake of the Haiti earthquake. A similar treatment was never given to Turkey and Syria, who suffered similar magnitudes, simply because Haiti was a geographically proximate ally to the US. The conclusion to this layer is that overwhelming financial influence over the World Bank perpetuates the empowerment of giants and its allies at the expense of vulnerable developing states. The second part explains how do we safeguard the equitability of the World Bank in proposition. Powerful nations can only exploit the World Bank when they hold excessively large amounts of voting power. Under proposition, the power imbalance is corrected when smaller nations have equal say at the table as a developed state. This directly leads to their development in two ways. A, it encourages more participation in the World Bank initiatives as recipients gain aid that is tailored to their economic situations. But B, it also gives them leverage and negotiations to resist coercion from large superpowers when their votes are more impactful on the side of opposition. But it is also less of an incentive for superpowers to also be able to forcefully bully other states. Developed states are in a global struggle to maintain their legitimacy and influence as bastions of global development. They are deterred from continuing their abuses as countries are more able to successfully outvote them exclusively on the side of proposition. But other tactics on opposition that might raise, such as vote buying or under-the-table deals, are more explicit and it's easily called out under our side of the house. Thus, countries have the ability and the incentive to also expose the dirty work of the US when they engage in unethical voting practices. Well, lastly, developed countries are still incentivized to stay in the World Bank as the vanguard of global upliftment. Thus, they will not go out of their way to exploit the institution only on side proposition when they hold them accountable. It is only when you promise them divine authority that they can seize power and exploit the World Bank to their advantage on opposition that they do this. Absent of this, large superpowers will still have vested interest in controlling the World Bank, but have no power to do so on our side of the house. Opposition's world is nothing less than a dictatorship on a global scale, and is a disaster that cannot be permitted to continue. We're so proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Now I call on the leader of opposition.
When Side Prop comes out and says that they're going to create nuanced solutions without any actual mechanisms for how they're going to do so, and with the short-termist nature of these developing countries, they cannot win today. What do we support in this debate? Firstly, increased recipient nation representation in non-voting capacities, such as the board of executive directors, that actually has a change on policy, which has been a strong trend at the bank for the last decade already. We also support the collective bargaining by recipient nations, as African states have begun to do, effectively dealing with their material on voting blocks because that's already happening under the status quo. Our main point of difference from proposition then is threefold. One, we maintain the USA's leadership at the institution. Two, we maintain a competitive incentive structure for more countries to donate more to have a larger number of votes. Then three, we allow recipient nations to focus their political capital on case-by-case negotiation to ensure fair outcomes in each context. In this speech, I'm going to prove why the status quo is superior to Proposition 12 by examining the three possible ways the bank donors would react, but firstly on some responses. Just a bit of extraneous rebuttal at the top of my speech. Firstly, we heard coming out from Prop that basically the World Bank forces these countries to go into poverty, entrench poverty into their systems. However, the reality is that entrenching corruption into their systems is far worse, especially when they turn towards the AIAB, which I'll prove later in my speech, even worse, right? We also think the kind of nuance they talked about actually looks like short-termism because these developing countries do not actually have the facilities to look long-term into the economy there. And then also on their corruption material and how turning to China, we're going to, I will integrate that into my speech. Okay. First argument then on the two most likely scenarios. One, these countries find other, more pernicious ways to control the bank, dealing with their material on corruption. Or two, they retreat from the bank entirely, losing massive amounts of funds. One, firstly here on forms of influence. As the USA, Japan, and other major lenders control the purse strings of the organisation, they will always have an effective veto, no matter how many votes they have, even if the World Bank tries to pretend otherwise. If you think, as Proposition does, that these nations have political incentives to manipulate bank policy, then they will likely want to exercise it no matter what. Their capacity to financially devastate the organisations means that even in an equal voting system, they will always be able to use threats to block decisions they dislike. If you believe that the US has any non-benevolent interest in the bank, then the adversarial backroom approach is far, far worse than the status quo. This is because there will be no legal or journalistic accountability that would also have much of the progress being made on transparency and accountability that the World Bank has been improving over the last decade, but also perpetuate any narratives about the World Bank being untrustworthy, breeding distrust, to make pushing more countries towards the Asian infrastructure development bank. Second and final layer then on why they're actually likely to abandon multilateral lending through the bank. Given that I've just proved the POP system doesn't majorly change the policy of the bank, it's largely useless symbolism for recipient countries. That symbolism is far more detrimental to the USA than important to recipients. The practical benefits of domestic development are visible and tangible to voters in the developing world. Comparatively, the amorphous benefits of global development, led by other countries but funded by domestic taxation, are uniquely hard to justify to voters on a utilitarian basis. That means as soon as the USA loses its voting power, they lose any agency to actually do it because their voters won't support it. That's why it's important for the US to be able to continue justifying spending on the bank as part of the US's pursuit of global hegemony and power, especially in an increasingly tripolar world. This justification means that US politicians will only support a US-led World Bank because without that selling point, the annual price tag of tens of billions of dollars into the World Bank becomes politically indefensible. If you're a poor American on the Rust Belt, you are unlikely to support what you now perceive as a drain on the USA's resources for no local benefits you will never see. Second layer then, here importantly, is that this is not a prefers debate where this change happens with no friction. One of the Bretton Woods institutions changing its fundamental structure to oust the USA as its leader would be major geopolitical news. It would weaken perceptions of the USA on the global stage and thereby raise China's comparative stability dealing with their material on China again. This would, A, weaken the USA's ability to maintain peace and order as the major multilateral at the height of an armed conflict with Russia, and B, be seen as a major ideological rejection of the US-led world order. These are harms that, in on the margins, even the most liberal tip the perceptions of global power to a less stable state. But more importantly for the bank though, not even the most liberal and globally minded US president could weather staying with the bank after such a large public embarrassment, rejection of funds, rejection of power. Even if you believe that the USA has some rational interest in continuing to fund the World Bank, it still needs to make clear that they call the shots in domestic politics, and to maintain control of other MLOs and bilateral relationships overrides that incentive clearly. All that is to say that this change is very likely to bring about a drastic, destabilizing decrease in funding to the World Bank. That is debate winning because global development is vital to human nature flourishing and how we're going to fix all the problems they want to claim under their side of the house. I'll take a POI now if there is one.
The World Bank already doesn't rely on the US to gain legitimacy after the entire globe has driven its functions for the last decades. Why would the US be an outcast in a global body that further cripples its legitimacy if that's the incentive?
Look, we think it further cripples legitimacy, right? Because it rejects the entire US-led world order, as I've just dealt with. But also then, we think it's far more illegitimate for these countries to be struggling for funds turning to other infrastructure. Okay, second argument then, let's take proposition at their very, very best and assume that these major donors are still willing to give huge sums of money to the World Bank without attempting to maintain control in any meaningful way. They still have to deal with a massive perception change as the US institution is no longer led and fundamentally guaranteed by the US, Europe, and Japan. Why is that harmful? One, most importantly, the USA's leadership of the bank is the cornerstone of its ability to guarantee such low-rate loans. Note they can't achieve any of their nuanced solutions without attaining these low-rate loans in the first place. Access to these loans are vital to developing nations, but in bilateral or private markets, developing nations are forced to accept onerous interest rates that they then have to service by cutting back on important social programs or restructuring loans. How does the World Bank bridge this gap? Wealthy donors, such as the US, essentially lend their AAA credit ratings to developing nations by collectivizing their wealth and reputations through the World Bank institution. This puts private financiers at ease and allows these developing countries to borrow at much lower rates, passing along savings. When debt markets no longer have the world's largest and most stable economies calling the shots at the bank, they no longer have the certainty that the World Bank will operate as those countries do. This means, one, sharp downgrades in credit ratings by the credit agency, which brings up the cost of borrowing. Two, fewer private and public trusts competing to sell debt to the bank, which again raises the cost of borrowing. Three, finally, in times of economic stress, where the bank is most valuable to these developing nations, lenders are more likely to pursue harsh conditions on debt restructuring as to recover as much as possible, as quickly as possible, because they no longer have the faith, the guarantee that the US, the EU, or Japan will cover 100% of the debt in case of a default. That means less hospitals, less schools, less bridges, less development, and a world full of far more poverty, or even at the very best, a world where there's far less agency to do these incredible projects, right? Then, on developing democracy, we think they are far more likely to turn to the predatory options that prop talks about themselves, like the AIIB or private loans, when the World Bank isn't able to offer these extremely low comparative interest rates. That's because the World Bank doesn't compete on price, and so non-democratic countries will turn to less accountable loans that are more likely to allow them to engage in corruption. That again deals with the material of corruption. They do this far less under the status quo when the World Bank loans are much cheaper. That means worse infrastructure outcomes, but also entrenching power into the hands of political and economic elites. This is very, very important in the debate because the power is entrenched with the few elites in these developing countries that are still building their civic institutions. It actively prevents the development of strong democracy because these elites are better able to control political dissent, or operate monopolies, or silence negative media, blocking out competition. This has compounding effects long into the future for the developing nations that affect all aspects of politics and governance, which is a far worse impact than anything they can change. Just quickly again, in terms of material on fiat, they don't actually have fiat in this debate. It's not this House would motion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for the fine speech. Now I'd like to call for the Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you.
On proposition, all we have to prove is that every dollar put in a politicized system that actively sabotages the development of developing nations is inherently a harm, which means that even if opposition gets $10 billion more dollars on opposition, it's $10 billion more dollars towards oppression, $10 billion more dollars towards horrendous infrastructural development, all of which don't actually answer their own burden of solving the poverty crisis in developing countries. On proposition, we create a world of equitable development, and that is the only world where equity and development truly matters. Two things in the response towards the mechanism on opposition before I talk about two issues in this speech. Firstly, I think I want to note that their mechanism of increasing diversity on the board is problematic for two reasons. One, because it inherits all of their exact same harms on the characterization of the pernicious incentives of developing nations. If it is true that the technocrats of these developing nations are going to respond to the wealthy elite in the country, and all of the developing nations are so corrupt they can't make independent decisions for economic policy in the World Bank, symmetrically, if you're bringing these corrupt individuals onto the board of the World Bank, influencing the policies, symmetrically you will still have the same horrendous outcomes that you push onto us. Meaning that this debate has to assume a world where the developing nations are not overtly malevolent, but rather they have their own ability to improve their their nations. They have technocrats, they have the best interests of the individuals at heart. If this debate was about horrendous dictatorships who did not care about their individuals, they would not be going to the World Bank on either side. But secondly, insofar as opposition wants to maintain the United States as a global leadership within the global bank, we don't think that that can coexist with, for instance, more diversity. Because that means that all the representation on opposition is contingent on the benevolence of the United States, allowing people onto the board, allowing people to enter, allowing them to have their say. If it is true you wanted equity so much, then the principal extension of that representation would be our policy, when your side only is reliant on the benevolence of actors, which we have proven doesn't exist on your side of the house, and you also prove in your argument that there is no benevolence. But secondly then, on the legitimacy of the World Bank, I think we would note that all of opposition's analysis is only relevant at the very start of the World Bank, but the World Bank hasn't yet built its own track record and legitimacy. Insofar as right now in the status quo, the World Bank is the greatest financial institution with a history of decades of good work, we don't think that you require the United States to opt in for it to stand on its own. Enough is, in and of itself, the World Bank has enough credibility to stand as an institution. So the parallel for the World Bank and the status quo would be like the United Nations. Anybody, even the United States, choosing to opt out of the United Nations would be damning for the United States, not the United Nations. And that is important because there are a multiplicity of developed economies also being able to run the World Bank. The United States isn't the only country that is relevant in this debate. But even if the United States political interests were relevant, we think that cost is actually very in line with all of existing American foreign policy strategy. I.e., American foreign policy was never just about benefiting individual allies, but rather about creating a global system and being a global leader and a moral actor. It means all countries around the world look to the United States as the savior when it comes to any global crisis, and the only way for them to successfully do this is create leadership through global institutions, not through independent bilateral aid, because that is not the perspective that the United States has taken for the past few decades. Two issues then in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the equitability of the World Bank's policies. And first, is it necessarily true that wealthy nations will still be abusing power through the system under our side of the house? We don't think that exists, because the abuse and the leverage of power only exists when you even hand them the power to begin with. So the best way to eradicate any so-called power dynamics on opposition is through economic development. When these developing nations are no longer relying on certain institutions for wealth, for poverty alleviation, they can stand on their own. And how that happens is through empowering the best form of aid through the kind of policy that we have under our side of the house. But even if there's any sort of bartering, we think that developing nations are more likely to win on our side of the house. We give them the tools to win over the kinds of political abuses that could happen. 15 ASEAN nations versus one United States is a very clear cut which side will mathematically win this. But secondly, I think we would know that our case isn't actually contingent on an inherent malevolence of America and etc. It is about the privileged perspective of the technocrats. So when opposition talks about the concept of credit rating, we think all of those are inherently privileged perspectives of what necessitates economic growth. Having a bad credit rating just means that your country is so languishing in poverty that you cannot afford that kind of rating. Having GDP growth, having a low federal debt rate, all of those things are indicators of economic growth in the status quo, but they are not indicators of the well-being of individuals. When you have GDP growth but people are still falling below the poverty line, when unemployment rate is rising even as the federal debt level is being okay, we don't think then we want the policies on opposition. This means that in the status quo, it's taken us decades to realize that the existing system of the World Bank is flawed. On their side of the house, they have to wait for the United States to say, welcome into our exclusive board of directors, now you get to have your say. On our side, we accommodate towards the ever-evolving economic needs of countries and allow them to represent themselves at every level in the best possible way. Before I go on, I'll take a point.
Conservatives in countries such as the United States are increasingly running on platforms such as reigning and global spending. How do you convince Republicans in the US to continue funding the bank if they've just been shunned and removed from leadership?
So I think politics has to be a multifaceted view, right? Even as they want to cut on spending, they also want to be the global leader. They want to beat China, they want to beat Russia, they want to be the most powerful moral actor on the planet, and the way they do that is through this kind of spending. If it's true that the United States is becoming isolationist, then there's no other policy they would run, but crucially, the United States at the forefront of its foreign policy is spend money on other countries to make them depend on us so that we no longer have to compete with China. But secondly, on the quality of development then, I think equality must be the foremost issue in this debate because it is the only factor that exclusively underpins the efficacy of all developmental aid. Two reasons here. One, if it is true that there's a limited amount of resources on the opposition side of the house, then every dollar they pour into a failing system that doesn't actually benefit individuals is a dollar they waste. Which means that secondly, on our side, if we prove that opposition actively sabotages sabotages the ability of developing nations to develop, they in fact require even more resources to correct for all of the harms they incur, correct for all of the poverty that they created because of forcing these countries to liberalize, to open their economies. On our side of the house, we don't need that much resources because we directly attack the root of the issue, we directly attack the problem without creating substantial harms that need to be solved in other metrics. And this leads me then to the last substantive about how the World Bank then must participate in a trend of the international community that aspires towards a norm of depoliticization for its institutions. The one country, one vote system is the corrective mechanism in ending the precedence of powerful nations toying with global institutions. Global institutions in the status quo are divided into two categories. So those that reward donors with more political power, like OPEC and IMF and the World Bank, and those with one country, one vote, like the WTO, ASEAN, and NATO. Evidently, the former are regarded as cartels accused of political manipulation, while the latter are lauded for their neutrality and expertise outside of the need for funding. So if we prove that there's no longer a need for funding, there's a move towards a global norm of inclusivity and equity. Given that we've proven that the funding mechanisms are not symmetric, but in our best case superior, the World Bank's failures to depoliticize manifest in two harms on opposition. Firstly, insofar as resources are zero-sum, opposition siphons the majority of global goodwill into a system that does not equitably allocate all of these good funds. But secondly, the bank's refusal to depoliticize as the most influential leading body in international finance indicates that it is acceptable to subvert the norm of neutrality and inclusion. It allows AIIB and BRICS to escape the pressure for reform. When everybody is equally as oppressive, we say you turn to AIIB. On our side of the house, we truly make equitable development equitable and make it so that all forms of development benefit the people, not just the wealthy technocrats sitting at the very top of their ivory towers.
Thank you for the Prime Minister for my speech. Now I'd like to go for the technical opposition. Thank you.
The World Bank, under your side of the house, forces countries to go to the AIIB or to bilateral malicious deals when the amount of funds that the World Bank can provide dissolves, as Joe Biden can no longer convince the USA that there is a point to this now perceived drain on the national economy. Three things for you today. Firstly, an extension on anti-colonialism because they wanted to push their one case, which was their principles, so hard. And then thirdly, on some responses on China, whether the World Bank actually provides good loans to good economies, and thirdly, on the benefits of US dominance. Okay, so firstly on anti-colonialism then. They gave us this push about how the principle of, about how this principle of countries not having a fair say in things that affected them was inherently wrong, right? But what we actually think is that when countries are giving billions and billions of their GDP, when the USA is providing $55 billion every annum to the World Bank, that these are reparations to poor countries as reparations for the harm that they have done in the past. America, not a great past in terms of colonialism, okay? Real reparations are in the lift out of poverty the World Bank currently provides to hundreds of millions of people as they've conceded. A lot of the case was about how the World Bank is the biggest global institution that helps millions of people get out of poverty. And therefore, the only thing that's will stand at the end of this debate for them is that under our side, nothing changes and the World Bank continues to do good for hundreds of millions of people. But in terms of anti-colonialism, right, we see this history of rich versus poor, colonialism, etc. And the World Bank organization funding countries, most of whom the World Bank organizations funding countries that lend their funds, most of whom were colonizers too, have an obligation to oversee the places this money goes into. Because injecting cash into a weak economy that is prone to corruption, not corrupt, but prone to corruption because in a vulnerable state that was devastated by colonialism, is not just. It is not just to inject cash into an economy that may corrupt it, unless a third party is ensuring that that weak post-colonial government is not corrupt and does not skim cream off the top. We don't think that the governments we're talking about here are inherently corrupt, but we think they're vulnerable to that because of the place they're in, because of the poverty they're facing. So, on some extraneous things. Firstly, PROP has no fiat to guarantee a minimum contribution for countries because this motion is this house should, right? And even if they did have fiat, it would be worse because A, the US now contributes less funds, but secondly, poor countries are forced now to take a higher burden, which takes money away from the citizens that they care so much about. Okay, so on some rebuttal. Their first push was about China, right? Let's talk about China then. PROP argues countries will go to China onto our side because the World Bank organization isn't kind enough to them and puts too many restrictions on. On restrictions, the loans that the World Bank gives out actually lift millions and millions of people out of poverty, give maternal care centers to women in West Africa, vaccinate against polio, and educate children, right? Okay. Actually, the kind of loans that the World Bank is providing are not loaded with conditions like free trade and democracy, as they've tried to prove, with no fair examples, with no mechanisms. The only example they gave was Senegal in the early 1980s. The World Bank has had increased public pressure since then. It is on an upwards trend. They cannot use examples from 45 years ago. Okay. In terms of the loans that the World Bank gives out, the harsh conditions that they talk about are things like your government can't embezzle these funds, are things like governments must have a clear path of development and be transparent. And even in the worst cases where they do impose things like your country kind of has to have an election if we're going to support you like this, right? We don't think that's a harm. We don't think they can prove that that's going to be harmful to these countries when actually the World Bank has an obligation to ensure the safety of future generations of these countries. Because once you have a corrupt government, it is infinitely harder to pull your country out of poverty in the future. Okay. So on those loans, right? Preventing embezzlement and ensuring transparency are generally good for the wider benefits, and under PROP, they can't do that when the developing countries are blinded by the suffering that they're facing. Okay, so therefore, there is no incentive under our side of the house to go to China. If countries wanted to go to China, they would have done that already. Again, we're on an upward trend. But PROP argues this. 3 more reasons why they won't. Okay, firstly, the AIIB is much newer, has less money, right? Okay.
Point.
Secondly, they see that Sri Lankan port that they were trying to talk so much about, and countries see that and think, I don't want my port taken for 99 years, won't go to the AIIB. But thirdly, it's symmetric, if not worse, because again, World Bank is on an upward trajectory, but also countries are more likely to leave the World Bank when they're forced out by a lack of funding because the USA has pulled out because it can't any longer justify to its citizens, who, again, short-termism, citizens want results now. If you're on the Rust Belt, you're not going to be happy about your government's funding going to a Sri Lankan school, right? The USA can no longer fund the World Bank as much. We proved that to you in your first speech. This means that countries are pushed out of the World Bank into the AIIB on their side of the house. Why do we think that's worse? Okay, firstly, let's talk about why the US is the best party to be giving these funds to these countries, right? Okay. When the US views the World Bank organization as an institution that is furthering their interests, it has a strong incentive to make that institution the best it can be. They talked about how the US has a privileged perspective on issues, right? But we think that the US actually just put 20% of funds in to vaccinate children, to help mothers solve their post-maternal health issues, right? The US does have developing nations' interests at heart, even if you don't believe that the US is benevolent. Again, as they've stated, the US's perception of global power and the US's interest in having that global power comes from their funds being used as effectively as possible, so that they are perceived as a benevolent power, so that it is clear that they are doing good in West Africa, meaning they have an incentive to ensure that their funds are used as efficiently as possible, help the most people. Again, the World Bank has been led by US for as long as it's been around, and they've said that the World Bank has done a lot of good, right? Even if the US were going around demanding dams were built in Eritrea, we reject that they are out of touch. We reject that they are making bad decisions, because the key here is that the US spends $50 billion a year to help fight poverty. It wants those funds, it seeks a stronger, freer world, and needs minimized poverty and strengthened economies for this. Therefore, the US makes good decisions about its money, and it's, in fact, an excellent party to make them. Yes, we acknowledge that the US is as selfish as any other country, but in fact, in a tripolar world, it has an incentive to increase its power, and the good thing about the World Bank is that it can do this without militia and without malicious trade deals. So, let's talk about the benefits of a democratic third-party decision maker in fund allocation like the US access. Most countries are not strong democracies and are much more susceptible to corruption and political favoritism than the US. Obviously, when it comes to billions of dollars of aid, there is a high risk that politicians receiving this have their own incentives, benefiting their own ethnic or religious groups, skimming cream off the top, or giving contracts to corporations that give back to their political parties. But because the US has no stake in ethnic conflict in West Africa, not only do we think US oversight is good in preventing corruption, but they also have an obligation under the World Bank vision to ensure that their funds are going to struggling people, not corrupt governments. Under our side of the house, we support giving as much money to struggling people as possible, not supporting like the Tuvalu government of 11,000 people who have a warm, fuzzy feeling that they are now being represented.
Thank you. Deputy Leader of Opposition for fine speech. Now I'd like to call on the Governor.
The problem with Team New Zealand's case is they want to wait. They want to wait for the World Bank to gradually reform. They want to wait for the US to gradually become better. But they ignore what the underlying rhetoric behind their case is. That they realize that in the 80s, the World Bank messed up. That the World Bank has to become on a linear trend of improvement, which concedes the problem underlying the World Bank was the dominance of Western powers and their hindsight about how they choose to run these certain policies. What we explained was that their timeline still trends towards the World Bank eventually becoming more equitable, eventually being one that cares about the interests of the developing countries. But it was exclusively proposition adopting this system that could guarantee the equity that was necessary in the long term. We were able to solve their problems the best. There are two observations I want to make at the top of the speech. First, I want to explain why their characterization of US incentives is fundamentally harmful towards their case. Because if the claim is that they only donate towards the World Bank in the present, for the reason they can politicize that aid, that precisely feeds into our reasoning about why this aid will be used in ways that are harmful, because there's no incentive to ever deviate from what the US considers to be good. And they never explain that even if why the US is has benevolent interest, why the benevolence will be carried out in ways that are good. They were given multiple reasons as to why the US having good incentives has always led towards developing countries being lost out, but how places like Bolivia were forced to privatize their water systems, leading to people's lives being hurt. So even if they prove there's a good incentive, they don't explain why the incentive is able to manifest well, and their underlying characterization of why the country wants to donate aid is going to be bad for their case. We explain multiple organizations, ASEAN, NATO, the World Trade Organization, all use a form of one country, one vote or consensus system that proves our characterization, which means that even if in the past we were reliant on the US to fund the World Bank, they don't explain why the present and the future is one that unilaterally needs the World Bank, needs the US in order to survive. We are at a certain point in time where we can create that change. That is what the opposition ignores. Second, their claim is that many of these conditions, such as transparency, are good. But this is in direct tension with their claim that the US will look for other ways to corrupt the World Bank. So in order to believe their case, you would have to believe an absurd characterization that the US always has good incentives, wants to be benevolent to developing countries. But the moment you institute the one country, one vote system, all those good incentives go away and they only care about their own power. That is the exclusive paradigm in which this team operates in, which is why they have to lose. What we explained the more likely counterfactual was is this. If these policies of free trade and high interest rates for developing countries were so good and the optimal policy, they would probably be voted for on both sides. What they had to explain was, why was it when developing countries would otherwise vote against these certain policies that we need the US to intervene and say, no, we want this instead? That was where the debate took place, and they never engaged on that front instead. 3 issues in the speech. First, on the survival of the World Bank. Secondly, on global representation. And third, on depoliticization and equity. First, on the survival of the World Bank, I want to note that all of their impacts are contingent upon the characterization that the World Bank will not have any money on our side. What were our mechanisms of funding which were not responded to? First, we still have minimum mandated contributions, and even if this is small, if you believe their claim, there's even 0.1% of the US GDP going into this bank is $23 billion that could go into vaccines, that could go into infrastructure development. But secondly, you still have things like NGOs and philanthropic investors that are willing to create these forms of change. Thirdly, you have the World Bank invests in the international capital markets to raise bonds and finance these projects. What we explained was that even if you don't believe any of this, the biggest countries in the world, such as the US, were donating additional funds is what grants them a position of global leadership to say that we are funding the World Bank, the largest financial institution in the world, and that is precisely the competition incentive they wanted to outline for the US wanting to beat China is precisely why they will still donate towards this World Bank instead because they want to prevent the outcome of them going towards the AIIB. What they don't engage with is that this money isn't being used in the most productive way right now. It's being wasted. What we said was that every dollar going to a politicized World Bank was a dollar wasted. So even if you believe they had more money, they don't explain why the money is used well. We only read through this. Finally, on survival, their only response to this was that our side pushes countries to the AIIB instead. But nations opting into alternatives is precisely the product of an imbalanced system on their side. It's because these developing countries cannot reach what the US wants about high interest rates, about cutting fuel subsidies, so they turn towards the AIIB instead. But their characterization proves why that doesn't happen on our side. For the reasons they give, the AIIB is predatory, the AIIB is exploitative. It's precisely why countries want to stray away from it. But it's only our side that provides them an avenue to get funds without going to the AIIB because they cannot reach the sky-high conditions that the World Bank sets for them. And in that second speech, they concede to all of this when they say that countries only want to deviate from them. They don't provide a solution to why they can go there. If their claim is that there's not enough money, we explain why we're able to get the money. So on both the grounds of money and having a place to go to, these countries can be cared for under our side. Let's have it.
Money is always tricky. Loans must always have conditions, especially for fragile and developing economies, because they are prone to default, shocks and are more devastating when they have less cash in reserve. How does that change our view?
The problem is not going to set zero conditions. It's that you have to explain why the current manifestation of these conditions is in a way that's good. What we explained from 2 speakers to no response was that many of these conditions are set upon standards that were highly unrepresentative of these developing countries. They needed to rely on things like the Human Development Index instead of a strict reliance on GDP, because that's more representative of the social things that they face. But how do we need to reduce your reliance on neoliberal methods? And you maybe sometimes need to use fuel subsidies to reel back from the COVID crisis. They don't respond. Second, on global representation. And here's where their team wasn't listening as well. We never pushed the abstract principles of anti-colonialism. They were rebutting an imaginary case. What we explained was that politicization can only happen if powerful countries maintain the power over the system. And it was only the one country, one vote that could create fair representation because it empowered developing countries to be on an equal playing field as the superpowers. That's why their counter-model of case-by-case negotiations is better done on our side. There's no incentive for them to want to negotiate with you if they know you can always be outvoted. That's why on our side you can push back against the power of these larger nations. Their engagement is that developing countries are short-termist, but they don't explain why this is true. One, in times of crisis, citizens politically pressure these governments because they can see the effects of inflation, how it's hurting their lives. But two, it's necessary to maintain the stability of your regime. So you want to invest in the long-term economic development. That's why in places like Venezuela, where people were starving, it created huge protests in response to this because they know that their lives were going to be lost and the governments had to respond. But thirdly, long-term development lets you build a diplomatic and economic strength. So this is why developing countries, even if you believe not all of them are fully democratic, have an incentive to invest in the best policies possible. In order to believe their case, you have to believe an absurdly elitist and unfounded assertion that developing countries can't survive without Western policy. Finally, on why we have depoliticization and equity, the impact of this argument is massive because we add another dimension to the debate by explaining how we set a new norm built on equity. If there was anyone that could spearhead this global shift, it was the World Bank, because we were at a unique point in history where no longer reliant upon them for funding, as demonstrated in the second speech. But what we said was that the US is more reliant on the World Bank for its global leadership, and the World Bank is reliant on the US. This team wanted you to believe the US will withdraw from the World Bank, but they never explained why this is in any way likely, given that the World Bank is how the US increases their reputational incentive. It's about how the US extends their aid to others. So even if the US doesn't really like this policy, they don't explain why it comes at the cost of them just moving out entirely. The Bretton Woods was meant to represent hope and peaceful rebuilding, but only proposition fulfills this purpose. On opposition, it continues to remain a symbol of Western-led oppression, which is why we vote for proposition.
Thank you, Governor, for Friday speech. Now I call on the off vote.
Opposition had to prove two things in today's debate. They had to prove that the current structure of the World Bank and the policies that enact are so bad that the single largest multilateral organization in the world and the single largest entity funding global development and the alleviation of poverty was so bad that we had to tear the structure apart and try something completely new. And once they proved that, they then had to prove that the new structure would be better and we'd have the same capacity and money to get the benefits that we already had in the present. They haven't done any of that, which means that they fundamentally can't win this debate. Because even if they prove one of those two elements, they don't get the combination. That is, a strong institution that has the money to do things. Incentives don't matter if you have no capacity without incentives. Three questions for this debate. The first on whether the World Bank is good or politicized and therefore harmful. The second on the survival of the bank. Finally on this vague principle of equity that they want to push. Let's first talk about the good or politicized. I think this point is important because a huge proposition push is that the current system of the World Bank is bad insofar as every dollar is funding a system of oppression, meaning that the money doesn't matter because the system itself is broken. That is important because if it is not true that it is harmful, or that even at the very least it does more good than harm, it therefore means that the money going in does matter and that every single dollar does contribute to something. They had to prove that every dollar was actively worsening the world to win that point. What did they heard? At first we heard two things. The first was that the World Bank imposes onerous conditions that worsen poverty. The second on politicization. Let's first deal with conditionality. They cite a vague example of how the World Bank's onerous market liberalization of free markets, such as in Bolivia, had led to exacerbated poverty for responses. The first is that we simply reject the premise that this is what the conditions usually are, right? We told you down the line that the conditions are often things like being able to see where the money is going so that the bank has some sort of assurance, being able to have a plan for how that's going to be repaid when the money is going to be spent. Second, that these conditions are actively good. Even if there are some examples that didn't work, like Bolivia liberalization, the incentive behind it was to try and push the economy into the modern sphere. Because command economies aren't good, it's unclear on proposition that's what they stand for. You should just do exactly what these governments think are best, because they're often not. Third, even if in some instances they are bad, we think the majority of cases significantly outweigh this to the extent that they don't matter. They had to prove that this was the majority of cases, not just some fringe instances. Finally, the alternatives are worse, because as we told you, alternatives like the Asian Investment Bank get preferred when the World Bank isn't the first choice. And here's what I want to note empirically. And if you think the Asian Investment Bank is going to just suddenly get so many new entrants, why haven't they already? The simple reason is because the World Bank is still the best institution for development. No one is forcing developing countries to go to them. They go to them because it's a good institution. That was an extremely unstrategic first push. I think the second point on politicization was the better push from proposition, in that the funding is allocated inequitably. So even if it is good, it is inequitable where it ends up. They cite an example of Syria not getting funding in the Turkey earthquake. 3 responses. The first was that Syria literally refused to take this funding. We don't blame the World Bank for not being able to give it to someone who didn't want it. The second is that if they hadn't refused, what was the World Bank supposed to do? Give the money to the Assad regime where it ends up unseen and disappeared into a black hole? Because the conditions are about transparency and giving it to the people. We don't want to fund the elites, we want to fund the people. That is what the World Bank always does. The final thing though, is that the funding does not go to a consolidated area because the funding goes to where people need it the most. It goes to countries like India, Indonesia, Asia, Africa. It goes all around the world. There's absolutely no mechanism to prove that the US has put any strategic interest. They haven't cited any strategic countries that the US has specifically pushed for. That means that they don't win on this politicization on a practical level. What does this all mean? It means that all they have on is the principle on politicization now. We'll deal with later. I want to quickly flag here that in setup, we told you that we support things like my decisions having consensus as the current structure of the World Bank allows for. What the vote system is about is the leadership and the executive committee, which is voted for on a cycle once in a while. That means that it's not about changing this specific policy necessarily, but about changing the leadership structure. That was the fundamental thing they had to deal with. At the end of this point, what it means is the policies are broadly good and better than what they have told us. That means that every dollar does matter. Let's look at the second point then on the survival of the World Bank. What do we hear from proposition? We hear that the World Bank will not survive because the current trajectory is that the bank is going to diminish in influence as the US exerts its control. I think that the problem here is that they don't address the fact that it's not just about whether the World Bank survives as an institution, it's about whether the World Bank is the preferred institution. We gave you two key pathways for why the funding will decrease. The first is domestic politics, the second is perception. First on domestic politics, we tell you that it doesn't matter if the leadership in certain wealthy countries think that the World Bank is good, it matters what the voters think. Because if you believe that Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, or Joe Biden will stake their political careers on building hospitals in Sri Lanka, they simply won't. Meaning that at the point you take a perception shift, which is that the World Bank is being ousted from the institution as a leadership position, they will have to defend why they're still giving billions of dollars. They simply won't do that. Now, their only response here is twofold. The first is, of course, saying that US politics means that there are other incentives like having China, fighting back against China. But the problem here is that the inherent thing that you do when you take away US control is you reduce their capacity to leverage their soft power, you reduce their ability to proliferate their strategic interests through the institution. That means they're more likely to do things like posture militaristically or pull funding because this is now a Brazilian institution or a BRICS institution that is no longer US control. Because the only way they can posture soft power against China is if the institution is broadly seen as theirs. As we flagged at first, this is not a change that happens miraculously. It's an active change that will be on frontline news for literally weeks. No US politician is staking their career for that. They therefore don't get money. But second, we also told you it's about perceptions, right? Because not only do domestic politics matter, it also matters how private lenders see the institution. And their claim here is that, well, things like GNI per capita don't necessarily reflect how strong the country is. Yeah, we agree. But it's not about on a moral sense whether we think that. It's about whether the Wall Street institutions and other private lenders will think that. And if you think that they will believe that a country, like a developing country, is as stable as the United States, that is fundamentally ridiculous. Of course the US is perceived as more stable. That means, of course, you get more money flowing into the institution when you have perception that the US is in charge. I think this is important because it means that even if the bank survives on proposition, it's an inherently crippled institution at the point it has this less money and less perception of stability. Because we didn't have to prove that necessarily it will be extremely drastic and the entire institution will collapse. All we had to prove was that the bank does good things and it will significantly reduce the capacity to do that under proposition. We have done that. What that inherently means is that even if the bank survives, the power of the bank to do good things is significantly reduced. I'll say that point.
So your analysis of the Rust Belt proves exactly why the loans will have political conditions. If it is true that America cares about their political advantages, why would they allow the World Bank to fund people they don't care about on your side of the house?
There's a difference between what Donald Trump tells his voters and what his policy advisors actually do. All you have to do is convince the voters that you are posturing strategically, and then what happens doesn't matter. The bigger thing you have to deal with what happens when you pull out of the institution. What that means is the policies aren't necessarily affected. What you have to do is tell the voters that you have some degree of control. That's what they care about, not necessarily the actual strategic interests. They're not on the ground. They simply don't know what's going on anyway. Finally then, let's look at the principle of equity. I think this is a really weird principle to bring up because firstly, the premise isn't even right? Because if you're talking about equity, India has a population of 1.43 billion. Indonesia, the second largest recipient, has a population of around a few hundred million. That means we're not sure why this equity principle matters on a population level, which is what we're talking about. Second though, we tell you that this is not the same as an organization like the United Nations, because it's fundamentally a bank about development, right? The UN is about sovereignty. I don't think we should be giving Canada equal representation from the World Bank because they don't need those funding unless they give this money in. It's a system without reciprocity, right? Because if the US is providing so much of their taxpayer dollars to fund everyone, we see no reason why a small country should be able to impose their conditions onto the money that's been given to them for free. If they don't like it, they can opt out. They don't because it's a good system. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, Albert, for the final speech. Now, opening all for time, close off the opposition space. Thank you.
Much of Malaysia's case is deeply uncomparative insofar as they critique the World Bank's costs and conditionality without comparing these to the astronomical market rates, conditions of AIIB loans, or the closest comparative, which is bilateral loans, as we explain, are all much more costly, are all much more conditional. They never engage with this, they can't win on the point of conditionality or costs of the World Bank. What can they win on then? They can win, they can win on this principle of equity that they bring up and push throughout the case, right? But as we just proved to you, this principle of equity doesn't even stand because, if you wanted equity, it would be population-based. We didn't stand for that because we still think that, the vulnerability of countries matters, but they can't push that unless they can prove sufficiently that they actually get real equality between developing nations, right? But secondly, these countries have the option to opt out, as we gave you in our last outro, right? These countries do not have to be in the World Bank, but they make the calculus that it is net beneficial for them to stay there for the massive benefits that they get from the development funds that they achieve through the US's massive funding to the World Bank and other powers, right? Countries would have opted out already. We gave you that at second, wasn't responded to. Secondly, though, if they want to push for this idea of equity where developing countries have their voices heard and have their say, it actually is already happening, except what developing countries want is a 3 to 4% debt to lending ratio decrease, which would put the future of these nations at risk, right? It's an example of a time when developing countries have an incentive to get the absolute best, but the US has a better incentive, which is that it isn't blinded by the current problems that these countries are facing and is instead able to look into the future, right? It's inherently uncomparative on their side because they don't look at the fact that these developing countries are blinded by their suffering and are not able to make good decisions. We don't tell you that developing countries are evil, we don't tell you that they're corrupt, we tell you that they're vulnerable and susceptible to this. Okay, so let's look at the alternatives that they brought up, right? We tell you that countries are more likely to go to China or the AIIB on our side of the house because they are pushed out by lack of funding, because any of the 3 US candidates, no matter how liberal they are, cannot concede to their population after such a huge public embarrassment that they are continuing to fund other countries rather than helping their own people, right? This means that the US pulls funding. They tell you that this doesn't matter because even 0.01% of the US's GDP would be $23 billion, right? But currently, the US is giving $50 billion a year to the World Bank, and that is double the people saved, double the hospitals built. Any equity principle is outweighed by that amount of people whose lives are saved, right? Okay. The alternative of China is A, smaller. The alternative of China is B, more corrupt. We cannot stand for countries being forced out of the World Bank by a lack of funding to these alternatives. The other alternative is bilateral loans, and this was never responded to apart from the fact that it happens under our side too. But the US doesn't want to go through bilateral loans, as we gave you at second. The US wants to keep this global power that they talk about. They want to look benevolent. This only happens when the US has no other options but to, do under-the-table stuff, right? Okay, now, final point of the debate on whether the World Bank currently does good. The World Bank acts as a wholesaler to reduce costs on receiving countries via its AAA rating provided by the US and buffer in the bank. The US is a vital is vital insofar as it provides that buffer and its reputation. Without the US, none of the benefits of the World Bank can stand, as we prove to you at third. The World Bank gives out loans to developing countries on a very, very small interest rate as opposed to the private market or the AIIB. That is a benefit that they can never claim on their side of the house. That is why we win today's debate.
Thank you to all for 5 fine speech. Now I'd like to call on the for 5 to close the debate.
To be blinded by suffering is to be in immense suffering. To care about your immediate quality of life means you don't have the privilege to envision a reasonable tomorrow, and these are the vulnerable actors that proposition protects. If the view of the United States sees GDP growth clearly at the expense of inherent suffering, that is not a stance that proposition wants to defend. When opposition says when countries don't like it, they can opt out, they force developing nations to opt into surrendering their sovereignty to China, opt into prolonged systemic poverty, and opt into the decimation of all of their industries, and that is not the purpose of the World Bank. 2 things to talk about in this speech, but before that, 2 observations about the case on the opposition's bench. Firstly, we think they have highly convenient characterization of the political incentives of the actors in this debate. On our side, the Rust Belt Republicans will eviscerate all funding from the World Bank from the United States, but on opposition, the same sexist conservatives would give away millions and billions of dollars for maternal welfare centers with absolutely no strings attached. If it is true on their side that the people are so politically aware, they cannot hinge their entire case on the mechanism that Trump is going to lie to his populace in order for the funding to fly. That is not a case that opposition can defend. What this means is that their characterization of status quo is contingent of some degree of benevolence, and while the United States will not actively go out of their way to create abuses, we see that when you make it conveniently available to them, that is where they allow politicization to occur. But second, we think their case is built on the elitist perception of the white savior complex. If it was true in their second speech that the post-colonial powers owe a representation, the solution is not to allow the oppressors to dictate that improvement, given we've told you that that improvement is going to be inherently oppressive. 2 things then in this speech. Firstly, on the nature of the World Bank as an institution in 3 ways. 1, we don't have to rely on fiat to say that we have money. We gave you 4 different funding mechanisms. If all of them are decreased, that is still a great amount of money that we're able to pour 100% into the World Bank's best policy. Our analysis on global leadership means not only will we have funding, we'll have lots of funding, but even if we don't, it is about the purpose of the World Bank. Secondly then, the purpose of the World Bank, in order for it to be functioning, still exists on our side of the house, i.e. you have the bare minimum conditions in order to build the infrastructure, you just don't use it for a political purpose, and that still symmetrically exists under our side of the house. But who then are the participants of the loans? Can opposition debate in a paradigm of malevolent developing nations? 2 responses. We told you 1, their own mechanism assumes the benevolence of the developing nations, but secondly, notice the case shift on opposition. They move from saying that these countries are going to be corrupted to that they are prone to corruption. So at the very end, there is absolutely no corruption. They are just blinded by their suffering. What is the rhetoric here that opposition ignores? What is the purpose of the World Bank if not to alleviate suffering? If you are blinded by your suffering, how much suffering then does opposition impose onto these individuals for a prolonged period of time? Economic liberalization, forcing these economies to open up. Surely in a vacuum, free trade is good, but not in every single instance. And opposition debates from the perspective of the privileged technocrats that we say are so harmful for the World Bank. Lastly then, on the political incentives, we say it's far better under our side of the house insofar as equity is not about numbers, it is about necessity, it is about vulnerability. Exactly because Canada has no need for the money, they have no right to have a say in it, and representation matters because of the most vulnerable individuals, not because 10 billion people are being affected on one side or 10 billion not being affected on the other. Equity is crucially the most important thing underpinning this debate, not because of a fundamental good feeling that opposition wants you to push, but the best feeling of having economic development only comes when you know exactly what solutions to be implemented. Insofar as there's no contention on opposition that inherently the privileged perspective makes it impossible for any reasonable policies to be instituted, equity wins and development wins on proposition. A different economic need doesn't mean corruption, just as how is decreasing GDP growth means nothing to the minimum wage worker who is nosediving below the poverty line. We have proven that the conditions on opposition are inherently oppressive, inherently antithetical to the purpose of the World Bank, and inherently oppressive under their own paradigm.